Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here on this Thursday. I'm so excited that you have chosen to spend your hour with us for this webinar, Does Sober Mean White? Collegiate Recovery, Racial Justice and Decolonization with Becki, Elkins, and Ting, Wang. Us at the Higher Education Center are super excited to host Becki and Ting, and we're excited to hand it over to them to share about the work that they've been doing on this topic. But before we do that, we do want to go over a few housekeeping things. First, we want to do a little orientation into Zoom. I know 2 years into this, it may seem rudimentary. It's like, Logan, we're experts at Zoom at this point, but just in case, your screen should look like this. We will be utilizing the question and answer feature in the bottom of your Zoom toolbar to ask questions of our presenters. So if you do have questions specifically for them, we do ask that you put that in the Q&A. We ask that you utilize the chat to talk about thoughts. Maybe you want reaction from other people in the webinar, if you want to introduce yourself. So I encourage you at this point, if you would like to introduce yourself, please do so in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, and what you do, and what you're looking forward to about today's presentation. If you do experience any audio issues, you should be able to solve all of those with the audio settings on the far left-hand side of the toolbar. If you continue to have issues, please let us know in the chat. Myself and M.S.Ed are going to be doing the back-end things for the Higher Education Center, so we're happy to help any of you that may need assistance. Do want to go over a few upcoming events for the Higher Education Center. We do have our upcoming water cooler chat for March that is going to be on March the 8th. We are going to be talking about fentanyl. We're going to be having a presenter from one of the research teams at Brown University. So we're just finalizing those details, but super excited to be talking about fentanyl and having a research expert from there. Going to be asking some questions, but also there to answer questions as well. And our next webinar will be on March 30th at 2 o'clock. About university presidents' perceptions of alcohol policies for college sporting events. So super excited for that. And with that, it is time for us at the Higher Ed Center to get out of the way and introduce our lovely presenters today. And so with that, I'm going to introduce M.S.Ed. I'm sure we'll soon be a doctor one day, but our Director of Recovery at the Higher Ed Center to introduce Becki and Ting.
Thank you so much, Logan. And hello, everyone. My name is M.S.Ed. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Director of Recovery here at the Higher Education Center. I also am an Assistant Director in the Student Wellness Center at Ohio State, where I get to support our staff who is doing our collegiate recovery work on our campus. And it is my pleasure to present our two esteemed guests, Dr. Becki Elkins and Ting Wang, before they do their presentation called Does Sober Mean White? Collegiate Recovery, Racial Justice and Decolonization. So Becki Elkins is an associate professor in the Department of Student Affairs Administration and director of the EDD program in Student Affairs Administration and Leadership at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Elkins holds a PhD in Student Affairs Administration and Research from the University of Iowa, a master's degree in higher education from Iowa State University, and a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Kansas, and has nearly 30 years experience in higher education. Elkins holds identities as a queer, white, cisgender woman in long-term recovery from substance use disorder. Her current research focuses on college students in recovery from substance use disorders. And Ting Wang serves as the coordinator of orientation and transition experience at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, and has 5 years of professional experience working in admissions, new student orientation, and collegiate recovery programs. Wang received her master's degree in Student Affairs Administration from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse and her bachelor's degree in communications from the University of South Florida. Wang holds identities as a queer, Asian American, first-generation American, cisgender woman in recovery from substance use disorders. And so thank you both for being here, and we are excited to hear and learn from you both today.
Thank you for that introduction, M.S.Ed. As was previously mentioned, my name is Ting Wang. I use they and she pronouns, and I'm joined by my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Becki Elkins, using she, her pronouns. And we're thrilled that you have joined us for our session today. So we'd like to begin our session by recognizing the critical importance of considering place and space. We'd ask each of you to join us in asking, how do I enter this space? What place do I occupy? And what history has brought me to stand in this place, to reside on this land? We'd invite each of you to consider these questions as we're all entering today from multiple places. The University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, Becky's institution, is physically situated on the original ancestral homelands of the Ho-Chunk people. The University of Wisconsin River Falls, my institution, and the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, my city of residence, occupy the original ancestral homelands of the Ochete-Shakoween. Iowa City, Iowa, Becky's residence occupies the original ancestral homelands of the Kiakapoi, Sauk, and Meskwaki, Bakoje, and Ochete-Shakoween. Consider the land you occupy and the peoples for whom it was and is home. Join us in paying respect to Indigenous peoples past and present, and their continuing presence in the homeland throughout their historical diaspora. And while we take a moment before we begin, I'd also like to acknowledge how folks might be entering this space today in light of the bombing on Ukraine. We stand in community with those affected by this tragedy. As we'll be discussing some challenging topics today, we want to respect folks' decision to step out as needed to process this news, and please prioritize taking care of yourself and how we can help take care of one another in this community. It's our hope that after this session, you'll be able to outline relevant demographic data related to collegiate recovery participation, consider the intersections of substance use disorder, collegiate recovery, and racial identity, articulate the ways in which systemic oppression, particularly racism and white supremacy, manifests in recovery in general and collegiate recovery efforts in particular, and consider strategies from ACPA's Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice and Decolonization framework to better support the personal and academic success of BIPOC students in recovery. It's maybe important for you to know that this presentation is adapted from one given to college student affairs administrators. Some of this information may be familiar to you. It's our hope, though, that as we dive more deeply into the discussion of racial justice and decolonization, that you'll find some new ways and new ideas to ponder. Before we begin, we think you should know just a bit about us. And so I'll pass it over to Becki to talk a little bit more about her story.
Thanks, Ting. My name is, as M.S.Ed has noted earlier, is Becki Elkins. I'm a faculty member in Student Affairs Administration Department at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And as noted, I identify as a queer, white, cisgender woman. I'm also a partner and a parent, and that's a big part of my story. In addition, I identify as a person in long-term recovery. I've been alcohol and drug-free for 23 years. So what that term in recovery means is a little amorphous, as you likely know. And I think it's important for you to know that my recovery from substance use disorder entails ongoing participation in a 12-step program that incorporates attending regular meetings and working with other folks dealing with substance use disorder. I mention that because substance use disorder, as you know, is complicated, and there are many different definitions of and approaches to recovery. There are also many different words that folks use to identify themselves, their substance use disorders, or their strategies for not using or for using less. So it's important, I think, then that you have some insight into the lens that framed my recovery. So I personally identify as an alcoholic and addict, and I do use those terms. I personally also identify as being in recovery. Both of those things are very much part of my identity. I also fiercely believe in the rights of each individual to determine and define what recovery means to them, and in fact, what words they use to describe their journeys and name their experiences And so we'll turn it back to Ting to share theirs.
Thanks, Becki. So like Becki, I also identify as a person in long-term recovery from substance use disorders, and more commonly refer to myself as a drug addict and alcoholic. For me, being in recovery means I've been completely abstinent from all substances, drugs, and alcohol since December 15th, 2017. I often use the term sober and in recovery interchangeably in casual conversation, although in my personal recovery, two distinctly different actions. So while I am sober, meaning that I am physically abstinent from all substances, I'm also in recovery, which for me means I participate in a 12-step fellowship program that centralizes community, service, and restoring and improving the holistic quality of my life. And to me, being sober is an individual act. So I recognize I can't maintain my sobriety without a community of folks who walk similar paths in recovery. Beyond remaining abstinent and being in a community of folks in recovery, I acknowledge that my addiction primarily is a thinking disease. So even though there's no substances in my body, my addiction is still active because of how my brain thinks. And so my recovery helps treat my brain and my thinking, because without it, I harm myself, I harm others, and lessen the quality of my life. My recovery identity is probably my most salient identity that I hold today, as it dictates almost every aspect of my life. As a young person, I'd like to think that I still qualify in the young people category, but as a young person in recovery who got sober while in college or while in school, it was vital that I surrounded myself only with people in early recovery who held the values I adopted through my recovery process. These individuals make up my chosen family, who are, a lot of them are pictured in that photo there on screen. I also identify as a gay first-generation Chinese American who grew up in poverty. And I'm privileged to also hold a master's degree and be a full-time student affairs administrator. My minoritized identities in particular heavily shape my experience as a person in recovery, namely that I don't always feel safe, welcome, and understood in all recovery spaces. For example, because of my socioeconomic status growing up, I didn't have access to treatment like many of my white counterparts. In another instance, as a gay person in recovery, I don't often run into many others who have to overcome the hardships that come with being an addict, on top of the systemic barriers in place to exclude LGBTQ+ folks. So Becki and I just threw a lot to think about your way, including different meanings of the term recovery. For our purposes today, just so we're all on the same page, let's start off by offering one definition of recovery that we can all use in this space. The Recovery Research Institute defines recovery as the process of improved physical, psychological, and social well-being and health after having suffered from a substance-related condition. Now, if you look at the collection of public images of people in recovery, looking at movies, TV shows, celebrities, and even the websites for treatment centers, if you look closely at that imagery as a whole, we think that it suggests that recovery is an opportunity geared towards white folks in general and white folks with class privilege more specifically.
So it's really important then for us as practitioners, as scholars, as folks who develop and implement policies and services, it's critical then that we ask ourselves this question. On our college campuses as a whole, does sober mean white? In other words, are our recovery programs and spaces geared towards white students? And I think to answer this question, we have to get honest with ourselves. We have to get honest both about college and recovery, as well as about our perceptions related to race. First, about college. We have to understand that where we stand today stems from a long history, and that history holds implications for us. Notwithstanding in particular historically Black colleges and universities or tribal colleges, the vast majority of colleges and universities in the US have been built for white folks. So Patton in 2016 wrote that we have to disrupt the stories we tell ourselves about higher education. In fact, she noted 3 propositions that are critical for us to consider. First, she posited that the very founding of our institutions is grounded in racism and white supremacy. Not simply that, but that we can and we do still feel that privilege, that power, and that oppression on our campuses even today. So recent scholarship, for instance, from Craig Stephen Wilder, Ibram Kendi, Nancy Bristow, Michelle Alexander, and many others has highlighted the role of slavery, forced displacement, anti-immigration policies and practices, Jim Crow legislation, and mass incarceration in literally and figuratively constructing our institutions of higher education. So when I walk across my campus today and I encounter a predominantly white student body taught by an even more predominantly white faculty and staff, I'm experiencing the consequences of that history. Second, Patton argued that imperialist and capitalist thinking frames both our history and the ways in which we operate our institutions today. So furthermore, this thinking intricately weaves together race and property and oppression. And in this way, whiteness serves as a commodity that can be and is used to gain and maintain access to education. My whiteness allowed me to live in certain communities, even though my family was much less well-to-do than many folks of color. That particular commodity then allowed me to attend certain schools that offered me certain academic and co-curricular experiences that prepared me to take courses and exams that then opened the doors of higher education for me. And finally, Patton asserted that our knowledge structures are also rooted in racism and white supremacy. Those structures serve to reinforce and reify oppression through the production of new knowledge that is similarly grounded in racism and white supremacy. So my professors, the vast majority of whom were white, taught the canon of their fields, which they no doubt had been taught by their predominantly white professors and so on before them. So there's nothing inherently white with being taught by white professors, I hope, since I am one. But what is problematic is the way in which some knowledge in higher education as a whole is seen as valid and valuable and worthy of tenure, for instance, while simultaneously higher ed invalidates and even disparages other knowledge. So the point here is that we have to ask ourselves what knowledge has been delegitimized, dismissed, or even erased. And because of that regeneration of racist, white supremacist knowledge, what knowledge are you and I missing? Then if we're going to talk about the history of higher education, we also need to talk about the history of the recovery movement. Patton's suppositions could be applied here as well quite easily. And if we did so, we would note that much, but certainly not all, but much of the modern day treatment and recovery programs and services is based on a 12-step model. And this model directly refers to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. So as you likely know, the history of AA stems back to the early 20th century when one struggling alcoholic was put in touch with another struggling alcoholic. And by working together and then eventually with other alcoholics, they managed to get and stay sober. And of course, there was a real need at the time to find something or anything that worked to help folks suffering from alcohol-related substance use disorders. So Dr. Bob and Bill W., the folks in these photograph, began holding daily meetings with other alcoholics in their homes, and eventually that spread, and other folks began doing so in their homes and towns across the US and eventually across the globe. So to reach as many people as possible, they decided to write their ideas down in what came to be published in the late 1930s as the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. So now there are a couple things to note about that point. So the traditions of AA talk about a singularity of purpose, meaning that the organization isn't trying to get involved in any cause other than, quote, bringing relief to the still suffering alcoholic, end quote. So AA hasn't, as an organization, promoted itself to treatment centers, nor tried to get doctors or hospitals or counselors or addiction professionals specifically to use AA or the 12 steps as the foundation for the recovery movement. That has happened without AA as an organization, distinct from what individuals might do, but as an organization has not promoted itself. Nonetheless, the 12 steps today occupy a solid position in the recovery movement. So, okay, what's the problem with that? Well, again, in and of itself, nothing is wrong with that. But there's something I think that we have to bring to the forefront of this discussion, and it's connected to Patton's suppositions. So we have to recognize that the Big Book was written by white Christian men who were alcoholics for other white Christian men who were alcoholics. And written in the 1930s, the first 181 pages of this book have not changed despite being on its 4th edition. So without question, this organization, the people, the principles, even the book, have saved the lives of millions of people around the world. I count myself one of them. But the language in the book and the stories are reflective of the 1930s. So now if we think about the role of white supremacy in our institutions of higher education, however benevolent they may be, we also have to look at our recovery organizations. And if we look at our educational scholarship and the ways in which our knowledge structures reinforce racism, white supremacy, and oppression, we also have to ask these same questions of the recovery movement. There are reasons why our recovery organizations, our treatment centers are not adept at meeting the needs of folks of color. And we don't have to look too hard to figure out that these challenges stem from their foundation and the regeneration of knowledge. And finally, we also have to be honest with ourselves and recognizing our implicit biases related to our beliefs about who drinks, who uses, who needs recovery, who can access treatment and recovery, and who's deserving of second chances. The fact is that in general, college students in recovery tend to be an invisible population on most of our campuses. This invisibility exists despite the fact that over 25% of 18 to 29-year-olds meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder within a 12-month period, and 37% will meet AUD criteria during their lifetime. In fact, citing 2017 research from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, Mary Shadley noted that 1 in 10 college students have a diagnosable substance use disorder, and that an additional 2 in 5 college students are at risk based on regular binge drinking. Hankey furthermore argued that 4 factors contribute to the invisibility of students struggling with substance use disorder or in recovery in general. These factors include campus culture, as we're aware, our beliefs about drinking and college and how those two are intertwined in popular culture as well as on our campuses, our difficulty in recognizing problematic use, and then also the stigma associated with substance use disorder, as well as the stigma associated with being sober. So today, nearly 40 years since the first collegiate recovery program emerged, there are 133 recognized collegiate recovery programs in the US, give or take a few here or there. That's less, if you put it in context, that's less than 5% of all institutions of higher education in the US. And the vast majority of those programs are located at four-year institutions, some private, but mostly large public, mostly historically white colleges and universities. And perhaps not surprisingly, as recently as 2016, research indicated that over 90% of CRP participants identified as white. So this invisibility that was suggested by Hankey is further exacerbated when considering the recovery experiences of college students from minoritized identities, particularly racially minoritized identities. This scholarship is largely non-existent. So when we talk about the research on college students in recovery, it's really important to note that we're talking almost exclusively about the experiences of white college students in recovery. qualitative studies from Yarusi, Woodford, Workman, and Elkins and Hankey, the 4 different studies, all elicited the experiences only of white identified participants. Other studies from Matsunaga and Werfler included majority white identified participants, each including only 1 student of color. So this lack of scholarship on the needs and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the collegiate recovery community was highlighted by panelists, presenters, and participants at the 2020 Conference of the Association of Recovering Higher Education. And it's important to note that these conversations took place in June 2020, shortly after the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and also while global protests against state-sanctioned police violence and vigilante murders were taking place. In response to what he called this moment of America's ongoing racial reckoning, Michael Eric Dyson wrote a book called Long Time Coming. Dyson is a distinguished professor of African American and diaspora studies at Vanderbilt University and is also a well-known Baptist preacher. And he wrote about 2 types of terror that serve as weapons of racism. Of course, he noted that one type of terror is fast terror, and that includes things like sudden acts of violence, such as police brutality, lynchings, murders, and rapes. But he went on to say that as much as fast terror scares, slow terror scars folks. And he noted that slow terror works less dramatically, but perhaps more insidiously. So in discussing this idea of slow terror, Dyson laid bare one of the key challenges that faces, I think, higher education. And that is the ways in which folks of color are denied opportunity through such factors as limited access, of course, challenging campus climates, targeted policing, even on our campuses, student conduct charges, behavioral and academic dismissals, and subsequent from there, denial of second chances. And in fact, Dyson went on to argue that the murdered and martyred Black and brown folks were not afforded the same second chance opportunities that are typically received by their white peers. And this very point, that is our perceptions of who is deserving of second chances and who actually receives them on our campuses, is essential to our deconstruction of the idea that sober perhaps means white on our campuses. So you might at the moment be saying, but wait, Becki and Ting, maybe BIPOC students don't deal with substance use disorder like white students do, or maybe BIPOC students don't need recovery like white students do. Okay, that's a fair question. Challenge is that the evidence doesn't really bear that out. So the 2019 National Survey on Drug Use and Health in the US, conducted by SAMHSA, revealed on the whole, generally similar patterns of reported alcohol and illicit drug use in the previous 12 months among 18 to 25-year-olds across racial identities. That same study then further revealed similar rates of past year estimated substance use disorder among 18 to 25-year-olds across racial identities. These numbers were estimated based on participants' responses to other questions posed in the survey. So it's important to note this part was an estimate. But if the rates of use are similar and the estimates of substance use disorder are similar, then we ought to expect the percentages of students in recovery to be similar. Yet 9 of 10 reported participants in CRPs identified as white. And if just over half of all college students are white nationally, then we ought to expect roughly maybe 5, at least 4 of 10 participants to be students of color. But these numbers don't align, are indicative of a multitude of potential problems. For instance, are BIPOC students who are in recovery even on our campuses? Or have they been previously dismissed from school? Are BIPOC students able to access treatment and recovery services? Are BIPOC students in recovery more likely than their white peers to attend institutions without collegiate recovery programs? Do BIPOC students see collegiate recovery programs as spaces specifically for white students and as a result avoid participating in those spaces? Or have BIPOC individuals already in recovery simply decided that college is not an option for them? These numbers and these questions suggest that both higher education and perhaps collegiate recovery have a racial reckoning of our own to address. So we can extrapolate from Michael Eric Dyson's argument here that as practitioners and scholars on college campuses, we have to wrestle with the ways in which our systems and our practices have been active or complicit in stealing the futures of BIPOC students in general and those in recovery in particular.
Okay, everyone take a breath. That was a lot that we threw at you. And now that we can all talk about recovery and this topic with the same kind of language and knowledge, what can we actually do? Y'all might be asking, this is super daunting. What are the actual action steps? Becki and I pieced this together using this framework that I'm about to talk about. And this is what we feel is not necessarily action steps of do this on your campus, boop, bop, beep, but, or here are the next steps, but more so some things to start thinking about and how to apply this based on the campus or the work that you are doing. And so in 2017, the American College Personnel Association, ACPA, crafted the Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice and Decolonization, what we'll call the SURJ-D, which is that model on screen. In 2019, Quay and colleagues wrote a bold vision forward, which details the SURJ-D framework as a means to address social injustices and outline methods to work towards equity and decolonization. As a result of using this framework to support students of color, we're inherently supporting students of other marginalized identities, including those in recovery. So at the core of this framework, you can see is love. When working with students in recovery, we need to center care, affection, respect, commitment, trust, honest and open communication. Speaking from my own experience, I've not always been treated from a place of love in higher education and in my recovery in general, sometimes justifiably so. Recovery is an ongoing and non-linear process. And so it's not always easy to love someone through that process and through decisions that don't always make a lot of logical sense. So now we're not asking y'all to make excuses for students in recovery or give students a pass. Instead, practicing love means a balance of challenge and support, holding students accountable. So we need to believe in students enough to allow them to fail, which can often feel really uncomfortable. But if we don't allow them to fail and directly learn lessons themselves, then we're indirectly communicating that we don't believe in them enough to get better and to heal. So when I think about centering love in my practice, I also can't help but think about patience and tolerance. Two qualities that my loved ones and folks that know me in the room here will not say that I'm particularly strong at. We're talking about equity-centered recovery allyship, right? So if I'm centering love, if I'm centering patience and tolerance in my allyship, for me, that means meeting allies where they're at. Trust me, most times I don't understand why people just can't read my mind and see the very clear instruction manual in my head for what to do and how to do it. I just don't get it. But I have to have patience with and tolerance of others to understand everyone comes into social justice work with different knowledge, and that is okay. And even if it's not on Ting's timeline, as an ally, it's our job to help educate and help others grow alongside us, even folks that don't necessarily think like us to begin with. So while the core of the SURJ-D is love, the framework is guided by a historical context. It's necessary to always remember the history of the recovery movement that Becki talked about earlier, and the history of higher education if we plan to work towards social justice. Having a knowledge of our personal and professional histories allows us to continue questioning our pre-existing ways of knowing to dismantle structures in place to block access for students in recovery. Within this historical context, there are 9 little rainbow veins there, or principles, that are absolutely necessary in order to move towards social justice. If we're applying these 9 principles to decolonization work and recovery, The SURGE model or framework can be applied in 3 general action steps. 1, being honest and open-minded. 2, centering personal relationships and community. And 3, empowering ourselves and our students. So the rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about how the veins grouped into these 3 categories can be used as action steps moving forward to creating more access for students in recovery, and specifically BIPOC students in recovery. So the first action step is being honest and open-minded, which can be demonstrated through 3 of the veins. The first being responsibility rather than compliance. The second being questioning the knowledges we use. And the third being an always becoming. And so when we're talking about responsibility rather than compliance, it's important to take ownership in our practice. How have we contributed to the oppression of recovering students? Being honest and open-minded takes courage to admit where one's privilege has taken space from those who have been marginalized. Yet it's important to sit in that uncomfortability, because we can't address the change if we have not taken or address the need for change if we have not taken the first step in acknowledging how our identities have perpetuated the problem. So how can we use, it's also important to question, how can we use our positions of power to disrupt existing systems? Our ethical responsibility to our positions and our privileged identities to make space for folks whose voices are not yet heard is vital. And so, of course, our experiences of being in various positions of power will look different based on the identities we hold. However, working in higher education, we automatically are in a position of power that our students don't hold. Our students in recovery being brought up in conversations in our respective departments. Are we being represented? And so, for example, in my work, in the intro, I talked about how I work in new student orientation. Recovery work is not the center of my practice anymore. It's the center of my identity. It's not in my life, but it's not the center of my work currently. So it's not brought up, recovery isn't brought up in every conversation with all my colleagues. I wish it was, but it's not. But it's my responsibility to bring up these conversations and bring up the needs of recovering students to these conversations and to the table. And specifically, it's important for me to bring up the needs of BIPOC students and start these conversations in spaces they may not traditionally have been held. It's also important to consider, are we just going along with processes because that's the way it's always been done? I am relatively new on my campus. I've been here since last June, and I'm in a position now where I have started a lot of change, and the pushback usually starts back with, that's the way it's always been done. Okay, well, who did that? Why are we doing that? Why are we still doing it this way? And this mentality, that's the way it's always been done, is often grounded in whiteness and white supremacy, which people don't always want to hear. They don't want that clap back. So why are we still going along with these policies today? Who are these policies leaving out? And are they serving students, today's students, right now? And so next I want to talk about questioning the knowledges we use. How does that relate to being honest and open-minded? The first thing I want to note is language. And language might be reinforced based on our geographic location. I know we're all coming from all over the place today. And so some of that language is important to consider. For example, some language might be triggering to folks in recovery, and I'm thinking about particularly for folks of marginalized identities, pronouns are not really talked much about in recovery language as it has started in early 1900s. And so thinking about how to expand that, is this inclusive for non-binary folks, people that are not just using the language that was originally stated in recovery work. Also thinking about the language we use surrounding a lot of recovery pathways still use some sort of higher power. And so as Becki mentioned, with the founders of AA, white Christian men. And so that's fine, more power to you. And if we follow that as the ideal only, it leaves out so many other cultures and religions and other forms of higher powers, and thinking about, are we framing this from an individualistic lens or a collectivist lens? And so starting to expand about what recovery can mean to different folks. And the last point I want to highlight here is, are we hearing stories of recovery from white cis men? Whose stories are we hearing? Or are we hearing that from white cis men? And that's not the experience of all people, or even most, I would argue. And so as we talked about before, as Becki mentioned, media racializes addiction. Who's being represented, and how does that impact what we think of recovery as the first thing in our brain? If we're operating under the assumption that, oh, this is what recovery has to look like, and that's from a white lens, that leaves out so many other experiences, particularly the unique experiences of BIPOC students. The last part of this, being honest and open-minded, the vein is an always becoming, and that's important to highlight because we have to continue to have dialogues that challenge our beliefs. There's no destination in racial justice and decolonization work. It's always evolving. Our knowledge is always evolving. There's no one-size-fits-all model of decolonization, so it's important to respond based on current challenges that we're facing in society. And so the next kind of action step, the next group that I want to talk about is centering personal relationships and community. I would argue that this is one of the most important of the three. And so the first vein that I want to talk about is developing authentic relationships. The three that we're going to talk about are developing authentic relationships, watching out for each other, and third, centering compassion and healing. So if we're talking about how do we form an authentic relationship, early recovery can be gnarly. My folks that are in recovery in the room today, you know what I'm talking about, okay? For me, it was gnarly. If it was free sailing for anybody else, please let me know. But it was not a good time for me. And separate from that, my experience as a college student, also gnarly. So on top of navigating early recovery and creating a sense of belonging as a young person, it's just a very challenging time. So it's important to keep that in mind, that this is, like, as I mentioned before, not a linear process, and that students are going through a lot. And depending on their marginalized identities, going through potentially more barriers, I'm gonna say factually more barriers than their white counterparts. And so it's also important when we're thinking about building an authentic relationship. Self-awareness. We have to have self-awareness of our own ignorance. And I know ignorance often gets a bad connotation, but just understanding our lack of knowledge. I don't know everything. None of us, I don't think, know everything. And so once we can name our lack of knowledge in certain areas, we can identify how to correct that and take action. It's also important to listen, actively listen. We're asking the question behind the question. For me, I know for sure in my early recovery and still today that I do not always be asking directly what I want and what I need and what would be helpful for me. And so in a position of power today, in my role in student affairs, it's important for me to ask and listen to what the student is really wanting and needing. And if I can ask more questions to get to what they really are trying to ask. It's also important to have faith that recovery is possible and continue that message of hope, because recovery can be such a scary process, especially for BIPOC students already facing all these different barriers. It's important that to have someone to look at, that there is hope, that there is, this is a journey, and sometimes there are dips in the journey, but that there is hope. Also, trust. Do our actions match our words? We've broken a lot of trust with BIPOC students just as being in a higher education institution. And so it's important that we're making sure that we're repairing that relationship, that we're building that trust back with those students, particularly BIPOC students, and that we're matching our actions with our words. And lastly, questioning what prevents us from developing authentic relationships. It's important to humanize our students. I think often, we just threw a bunch of data at you, but when it comes down to it, we are dealing with human beings who have experiences, who have stories, history, come from culture, have emotions, have families, and it's important to get to know that about the individual and to not make some sort of generalization for all students with this identity and really go to the source. The next vein I want to talk about is watching out for one another. Particularly, what I think of is fear as a barrier. Students in recovery fear that they're alone. And so connecting them to others connection is so, so important. But on the other side of this, when I think of allyship, I think that folks working in higher education fear failure, fear accountability, fear conflict. And so that is a barrier because it often results in inaction and complacency. And I've had mentors in the past say that inaction is still an action. And so it's important that we're holding each other accountable and saying to walk through that fear, and how are we having that love, compassion, and tolerance of others so that we don't have this fear as a barrier. It's important to communicate that students and allies are not alone. And this may be particularly challenging to communicate at predominantly white institutions, PWIs, because it does feel like often we're alone. There aren't many people that look like us or understand that we can't separate our identities of being in recovery from being marginalized in other ways. And there aren't many people at PWIs to talk about that unique struggle. And so my sister, I got sober in Florida because I went to college there, not by choice. And so in Florida, we were on a boat, and when I got sober, and we jumped on a life raft to sail out to sea somewhere. And so my sister uses that a lot. It's like, just get on the life raft. We just have to stay in community with one another and take the hand that's being given to us. So the last thing that I want to share with this vein is centering compassion and healing. It's important to see someone's pain, their trauma, their oppression, and having the desire to alleviate it. And so are we truly doing all we can? It's important to ask, because I mean, I'm in meetings all the time where people are like, well, we did everything that we could. Did you? Did you do everything we could? I mean, I know for sure that I'd be like, I exhausted all the options, but did I really do all I could? And I think it's important to hold myself accountable to that and others to accountable to that as well. And question, what am I willing to give up to make space for those who have had spaces taken away from them? And I think this is incredibly important. Don't give up on us, folks. I mean, recovery is not a linear process. I said it once, I'll say it again. I think that at least for me, I often want to give up on myself in my recovery process. And so when people that don't have that experience believe in me, it means everything to me. And treat ourselves with grace and love and kindness. And so last little section here, I'm going to try to fly through this so we have time for questions. Our last point here is to empower ourselves and our students. And we can do that through the three veins of educating through problem posing, emphasizing agency, and suspending efficiency and embracing dialogue. And so when we're thinking about educating through problem posing, we want to encourage self-authorship among students in recovery. Colonialism assumes that learners, when they enter an environment, know very little. And educators, on the other hand, are information experts. But in recovery, there are no experts. We're on a continuous journey of learning and learn from peers laterally. We need to view students in recovery as co-creators of knowledge and decenter power and space. There's no right or wrong way to recover. I wish there was, because, well, actually, not really. Even if there was a very clear do this, I'm still not going to do it. But it would make things a bit easier. And so there's not a right way or wrong way to recover. There's just what has worked for us as an individual. Some people, I partake in abstinence from all substances. I also know folks that engage in harm reduction. And that doesn't work for me, but it works for other people. Who am I to say that it doesn't work in general? So we can't tell a student how to recover, because we'll never know their lived experience. They're the expert on their own life, and they know what works for them. And all we can do is make suggestions. The second vein I want to talk about is emphasizing agency. So we've talked about self-authorship. How do we help students get to that point where they're able to have to vocalize their self-authorship? How do we help students succeed academically, socially, when they feel isolated because of their identities, including being sober? It's important to evaluate what purposes do policies serve? Why was this policy created? Who was left out when thinking about this policy? How can we create policies that address the needs of all students, not just the majority? How do we create space for students to share their truths without judgment? There's so much stigma surrounding addiction and recovery. And Becki and I, in our research, talk about, and others have talked about as well, this abstinence hostile culture on college campuses. What spaces, or if any, are free from stigma, and how do we create those for students to share their experiences? The last vein I'm going to talk about is suspending efficiency and embracing dialogue. We want to build relationships and trust. And recovery itself takes time. It takes time. And so my sister, I mention her a lot because my sister at the time did not identify as being in recovery, and she was in good old Al-Anon. And so she was the help. And so she loved to force her little timeline on me, and I could tell you that did not work. She would love to say, oh, Ting is recovered, and then I take a dip and Ting is no longer recovered. And I was like, girl, you say this one more time. And so I'm really not about to be recovered. So all of this is to say that we can't force a timeline on students. They have to go down this journey themselves, which is also often painful as an administrator to watch, because they have to go through this journey themselves. And even if it's not always the most efficient way to do it. And lastly, as I mentioned before, active listening, and then collaborative learning through dialogue. We're learning laterally alongside them. So with this approach to our work, according to the SURGE-D framework, we can hope for 3 specific outcomes. First, we can expand our critical consciousness. That is, that we can come to better understand both our social identities and the societal forces that create and sustain oppression. I can ask myself critical questions about my identity, my recovery, and my practice. I can ask questions about how collegiate recovery efforts on my campus have benefited from or been shaped by racism and colonization. I can ask questions about who shares these experiences with the researchers and why the voices of students of color in recovery appear silenced or even non-existent. I can critique how knowledge generation has simultaneously exploited the experiences of folks of color and reinforced racist and white supremacist perspectives of what counts as knowledge. I can then better work to identify and disrupt those places where oppression is limiting the opportunities for BIPOC students in recovery. The second outcome there is the framework works to achieve radical democracy. So according to the authors, radically democratic higher education commits to questioning, to justice, to hope. With these commitments, we have to question and critique institutional practices. For example, do we have a specific grade forgiveness policy, or do we handle such cases only through appeal? And what do we know about whose appeals are granted versus whose aren't? We must work to challenge stigma and remove other barriers that prevent students of color in recovery from actively engaging with collegiate recovery communities, or, as the author stated, from exercising their own voices in defense of their agency, either within these communities or in creating their own communities. And we must commit to hope that another way is possible, that a just world in which students can experience freedom from oppression and liberation from an obsession with alcohol or drugs is possible. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the principles lead us to humanize our students, as I mentioned before. Those students struggling with substance use disorders or in recovery in general, and above all, BIPOC students dealing with a substance use disorder or living in recovery. We're not a statistic. The experience of one student in recovery or one BIPOC student in recovery do not speak for all. So we need to continue to hear individualized and unique stories of recovery directly from the source through personalized relationships and not just from white students. So in conclusion, as the authors noted, we must each find a way to know each other as full beings with value, importance, needs, and agency. We challenge all of us to use the strategic imperative as a means for bringing racial justice and decolonization to collegiate recovery efforts on all of our campuses, because honestly, sober doesn't and shouldn't mean white. Thank you.
There were a
Thank you
couple
both
of,
so much. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Elkins, go ahead.
no, go ahead, Ahmed.
No, I just wanted to thank you both so much for your presentation. And I also wanted to take a moment to recognize that I think I
So sorry about that. Ahmed was getting ready to say that his power cord he can't find it for his computer, and his computer was about to die. And so we all experienced that in real time. So sorry about that. And so Dr. Elkins, I think I heard you mentioning questions. And so I'll just kick it over to you to talk about those that have already come in.
Thank you so much. I'm still losing the mute button here after 2 years of being fully on Zoom. There were a couple of questions that were posted in the Q&A that I think were really excellent questions, and Ting, you may want to chime in here, having to do with the role of identity and substance use disorder and being in recovery as whether or not that's really an issue of intersectionality in terms of identity with other minoritized identities. And so my response for folks that didn't see it is that I certainly, at times I'm hesitant to conceptualize SUD recovery as intersecting. At the same time, for me personally, I know that my recovery, my substance use disorder, et cetera, were all affected by, and how the access to resources I have been affected by my sexual orientation, my gender identity, my racial identity, my social class standing, et cetera. And so, so that's sort of the question, Ting, and open to hearing from others if they have questions they'd like to toss out as well.
Thanks, Becki. If I am misinterpreting this question, please someone flail your arms. But for me, when I think of intersectionality, and particularly with my identity as a recovering person, and as I mentioned in the presentation, there is no way for me to separate being a recovering person from being a Chinese American, from being a gay person, from all these other things, as being raised in poverty, all those things. I cannot look at my recovery without looking at it from the lens of my experiences that I face every day. And I think especially, I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I work in a very rural town in Wisconsin. And even when I speak about recovery, it's hit or miss whenever I go to meetings, 12-step meetings, because I can say, this is not a meeting space, so I can say it here. I live outside of Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, and still people are having conversations about that, and that affects me more, I would say, affects me more as a person of color than it does a white person in recovery. And I can't talk about how that fear of being a person of color in this area is affecting my fear of living, which is my recovery in recovery spaces. And so that's just one example of how I can't separate the two for me. And that has been particularly challenging in the past year and a half for me.
Thanks, Ting. I don't know if you're able to see the questions, but the other question that's up at the moment, I think points to some of the big issues that we've been talking about in our research, which is, what do you do if you're at an institution with no collegiate recovery program, and simultaneously have a majority BIPOC student body? How do we get this work started? So I'm going to toss it back to you to see if you have thoughts about that.
So we do not have a primarily BIPOC serving institution. Neither one of us, Becki nor I. It's a little rough in these parts of the Midwest. But I will say we're both on institutions. Becki and I did recovery work together previously at La Crosse, and now we're at separate institutions. But both of us are at institutions where we don't have I will argue, no recovery resources. And so, and at my campus in particular, it was quite shocking. I mean, we don't even talk about it in the orientation process, which I'm like, we're not even bringing up like drinking culture to college students, like in a small town where all there's to do is drink, quote unquote. Like, it's just rough. So I think for me, what has helped me on this campus is know who to talk to, know who has, know who the loud voices are on campus, from a perspective of who's going to make a stink kind of perspective, who's going to draw attention to this issue, but also who is in a position of power that they can actually make change. And so like at La Crosse, I was like, we're going to the chancellor. The chancellor is actually not the person we should have gone to, and we didn't. But there are steps before that we went to actually make change that were more effective than if we just went to the head honcho, which is what I would think immediately. And so I think to really assess the politics on my campus has been effective in my role of who can I actually go to that things are going to get passed immediately and don't have to go through all this gatekeeping has also helped me a lot.
Thank you both so much. And so I do want to be conscious of time. We are a couple minutes over time, but I want to thank you for a very illuminating presentation. I also want to, I was trying to apologize last time, Ting, because I think I may have mispronounced your name, and I should have asked before I introduced you what the correct pronunciation is. And so I apologize for that. And also for disappearing. It was like I was here 1 second and then I was gone at like the snap of a finger. It was so weird. And then I was back. And so I just wanted to apologize for that disconnection, and thank you all for a wonderful presentation and for your time here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. That is the conclusion of today's webinar. The recording will be live on the higher education website by Thursday of next week. Thank you all so much and take care.